When it comes to sports, there's nothing quite like taking a dive in boxing. It's a subject that is just endlessly fascinating. For starters, you have an individual or a promoter or someone willing to risk their career and their reputation in order to achieve a short-term gain. But that's only half the story, because they also have to partake in a boxing match, one of the most brutal and vicious events when it comes to sports. In many ways, I like to think of the dive as an art form. Like all art, some of it is good, some of it's bad, but it's all worth looking at nonetheless. And that is what we're going to do on the Touchback today. It is all about the art of the boxing dive, and we maybe, just maybe, get into how it possibly, if you butterfly effect it out, caused the death of Tupac Shakur. But we'll get to that in due course. There are a few different types of dives a boxer can take, but the most common one, the one that we see most frequently, is when a fighter agrees to not only go down, but go down in a certain round. This has obviously been made famous in various mafia movies, and just, I think, sort of the sports history, taking a dive has just become its own sort of mythical thing. The key to any dive, though, is making it look as real as possible, and that means on some occasions, the winning fighter isn't always in on the fix. They want that person to look and act as if they normally would. If someone knows they're going to win and is trying to pull their punches or take it easy, well, it's going to look suspicious. As for the losing fighter, well, they have to look somewhat competitive, but also not be threatening in the least bit, because an accidental knockout or just winning unintentionally would obviously be terrible. It would ruin the dive. It's difficult to pinpoint when the first dive in boxing history took place, because the act is probably as old as the sport itself, but most early examples were happening at these really low levels that most people wouldn't have been aware of at the time, or just simply never gained notoriety. Interestingly, many people believe Jack Dempsey, one of boxing's original superstars, actually took a dive during the early part of his career. This allegedly happened during a 1917 contest in Utah. Now, there's no proof, and Dempsey's never gone on record saying it, but what has drawn a lot of red flags is the fact that it was the only time Dempsey ever got knocked out in his career, and additionally, that all of the reports of what happened during the fight don't quite add up. Many people have many different accounts of what took place during this fight. There were a lot of shenanigans around this, and Dempsey's wife actually said in a book that he did throw the fight, but we don't have any proof of it, even if it does look incredibly questionable as to why he lost. The most famous boxing dive in history took place in 1947 when Jake LaMotta was upset by Billy Fox. LaMotta would actually admit that he took a dive to the U.S. Senate in 1960 during hearings when the government wanted to know more about how the mafia had managed to infiltrate various public institutions.
I said I would lose to Billy Fox if I was guaranteed a championship fight.
What makes this dive unique, however, are the motivations of LaMotta to lay down in the ring. While most of the time the loser ends up receiving a bigger payout from the mafia or whoever wants them to take a dive, LaMotta was actually doing so to get a title shot. In fact, he would pay the mafia money in addition to losing this fight for his eventual title bout. We honestly have no idea how many times a boxer has agreed to take a dive or not, because it's actually quite problematic to prove. Take a 1945 contest between Willie Pep and Lulu Perez. Going into this bout, everybody knew that Pep had money issues and a pretty massive gambling problem. He also had historically been a fighter who almost never got punched. He was really great at what he did in the squared circle. Not so much on this occasion, though. Lulu Perez won in what was a surprising fashion at the time. The issue, however, is despite all of these factors and all of those things people knew about Pep heading into the fight, there was no smoking gun. There was no evidence that proved Pep actually took a dive. That is what, again, makes the whole concept of taking a dive really difficult to prove. The fighters who are good at taking a dive are able to do so in a manner that gives them plausible deniability. Just sort of, well, I had an off night. I wasn't taking a dive. I just wasn't very good during this contest. This goes back to the boxing dive being an art form. Someone like Pep was a master at this. He could create a masterpiece of taking a dive that, gave him that plausible deniability. Like all art though, some of it is really good and others not so much. So while Pep was a Picasso or a Velasquez or whoever, now we turn our attention to the late Leon Spinks, who was basically that guy at a carnival painting caricatures. As the man who once beat Muhammad Ali was trying to make a comeback during the 1990s, he fought a boxer by the name of Eddie Curry. Sorry, that's E-D-D-I-E and not E-D-D-Y Curry. Anyway, the record book shows Spinks winning this 1994 fight. However, his victory wasn't really a victory at all, according to Charles Farrell, who was Spinks' manager at the time. Despite having lost the fight, there was some confusion as to how many rounds were actually supposed to take place. It went for 8 rounds, however, some advertisements had it scheduled for 10 rounds, so Spinks' manager decided this is where he was going to interject himself. Instead of heading back out to the ring to complete those last 2 advertised rounds, Curry's manager and Spinks' manager went into the locker rooms and quote-unquote settled the result. Here's how Farrell explained what happened in an interview with media. All we need to do is phone it in to the record book as a TKO win for Leon. As long as it's reported that way, that's what the record will say. I don't care what 300 people have seen, it's not going anywhere. And so we made a deal and Leon got the win. This is a very rare case of the winning boxer actually taking a dive in the locker room after the fact. But yeah, this was pretty lame if I'm being honest. As bad and pathetic as that was, the 2000s have seen some even worse attempts by boxers to take dives. Look no further than this 2004 contest between Hasim Rahman and Mario Kali. Kali has clearly bet on himself to lose this fight by knockout, but also doesn't want to get hit at all. You kind of have to admire his audacity here. I mean, there are a few times he just throws himself down onto the mat instead of letting himself get hit. A decade later, Curtis Tate would do one better in his fight against Zhang Zili. Words aren't even needed here. This is obviously a dive to just about anyone who watches it. The flop and the phony surprise look on Tate's face after being knocked down by the shoulder punch, though, are clear signs that the fix is in, and I think are probably the most enjoyable parts of it for me. Sometimes, though, a boxer takes a dive because they do not want to have their brains beaten in by a superior opponent. That was the case in 1996 when Bruce Seldon found himself up against an in his prime Mike Tyson. The first knockdown saw Seldon just throw himself to the canvas. Then he got knocked down a second time, took a look over at Tyson wanting to murder him, and pretended to have wobbly legs. What Seldon has done here is so comically obvious, although I can't say I blame him. This was not going to end well for him in any way, shape, or form. So, just diving here and getting out of the result was probably in his best interest. There is, though, a weird butterfly effect theory that relates to this dive in particular. You see, this also happened to be the night Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas. Let's remember, Tupac was actually attending this fight. Now, there is probably an alternate timeline or reality where if Sheldon decides that he wants to continue on the fight and maybe get past the first round, what Tupac does after this and where he ends up that night in Las Vegas could be totally different and maybe sees him not get shot. Of course, we don't know how it was working. We don't even know who shot him, but I just think this is one of the most interesting, again, butterfly effect timelines as it relates to sports, because if you think about it and you sort of line up everything that happened here, it is plausible that Tupac's timeline is totally different if Seldon had not taken a dive in this 1996 fight against Mike Tyson. Although that, again, like I said, I can't say I blame him. Honestly, I can't blame any boxer for taking a dive during their career, regardless, by the way. It is a brutal, vicious sport where your career is probably not going to last long unless you are Evander Holyfield. So, while it isn't great, and while it obviously causes a lot of problems and is illegal, you can sort of see the justification behind it. That being said, if you are going to take a dive, hone your craft, practice your art, and make sure you don't end up looking like Curtis Tate, because that is one of the few cases where you can point and say, dude, you took a dive.
This one has a glass glove. His left glove gets hit. Watch, the first one goes, now that's nothing. Then the other one hits the shoulder. I'm sorry. Tate has a glass shoulder.
That does it for me. I have made it the full 12 rounds without taking a dive or laying down or whatever the case may be. I'm Cheyenne Hollis. This is the Touchback. Subscribe if you like. And as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.